All right, folks, we'll get started in just a second. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Anne Gallagher to Duke Law School. Anne is one of the world's leading experts on human trafficking and also on the international legal policy aspects of human rights and the administration of criminal justice as they relate to human trafficking. She is someone who has held a wide variety of different positions in the United Nations as an advisor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, working with NGOs, as a legal scholar, as a teacher, as an advocate, and she has worked in many places around the world, not just her home of Australia and not just in Europe, but most recently now leading a multi-year research project orchestrated by the UN Crime Commission, focusing on the problematic elements of the international legal definition of human trafficking. So Dr. Gallagher has been there since the beginning as this field has evolved. She is, I've just pitched her book. This is now, 2010, yeah?
Yeah.
So it's already 4 years, can't believe it. This is, if you're interested, for those of you who don't already know, kind of the must-read book for human trafficking. And now, yet again, just when I thought I wouldn't have another enormous book to read, but The International Law of Migrant Smuggling is just out this year, yeah? From Cambridge University Press. So Dr. Gallagher will speak for, about 30 minutes or so, and then take questions for all of you. So please join me in welcoming her to Duke Law School.
Okay, well, I'll begin by saying really what a pleasure it is to be here at Duke, and to thank Professor Helfer for that lovely introduction. It's so great to be here. I've never been to this part of the US before. It's so warm, but just as lovely as I would imagine. Okay, look, I think that with an event like this, we only have an hour, and maybe to you that seems like a long time, but to me it seems quite short. So what I'll try and do is just talk, even for 20 or 25 minutes, to try and give at least half an hour for us to discuss and to maybe argue about some things, because I feel like one of the great joys of the areas that I work in is that there's huge room for argument and disagreement. And one of the things that worry me more and more about the human rights framework within which I work are some of the contradictions and conflicts that are coming to the surface. So maybe we can talk a little bit about those. Now, I understand most of you in this room kind of know something about trafficking. Is that sort of right? Does anyone know nothing about trafficking?
That's also okay too, by the way.
Okay, would you raise your hand? Okay, well, let's just see. What I'm actually planning on doing is to just talk a little bit about my career path, and to then use that, because it's not that interesting to me, to use that as a bit of a springboard to go into some different directions, including human trafficking. So, yeah, I was at law school quite a long time ago now, and not a particularly brilliant or interested student, I need to tell you all. To confess at the outset, until I did my first course in international law, and that really changed everything for me. I was only at law school because it seemed I couldn't decide what to do, and I just did the longest course I could find. But when I started to study international law, everything changed, and I knew that was exactly what I wanted to do. I went on to do a master's in international law after I finished my undergraduate and my law degrees, and then worked as a junior lecturer at the Australian National University for a couple of years. And then one day somebody came into my class. I was teaching the master's program, and we had people from different parts of the Australian government. They were the main students, in fact, from defence and foreign affairs, etc. And he said to me that afternoon at 5 o'clock, applications for the exam to enter the UN would close. And he was from our Foreign Affairs Department, so he actually knew that. Now, I'll explain to you, for those of you who don't know how this works. The UN has an international civil service of, 30,000 people. And that civil service is, because it's a member organisation, it's supposed to be reflective of all of the member organisations. So it's supposed to have representation from all different UN member states. And what the UN does is every year or so they go through their staff list and figure out which countries are underrepresented within the organisation. And in those countries they hold exams. So it's kind of really very unusual that you'll be in the right country at the right time, and I think you have to be under 32 or something. You have to have an advanced degree in the field that you're doing the exam in, and all of these things need to come together, and you have to know about it, not 45 minutes before the closing date. So I managed to get my application in, and I sat the exams. They went over a couple of days. There was a general knowledge exam first, and I didn't know how to study for that, so I learnt all of the capitals of the world, which I still know, but unfortunately it wasn't on the paper. But it's kind of useful to know something like that, even just to show off at the opportune moment. And then that was really interesting. Everyone sat the same general knowledge exam. They were looking at analytical ability, general knowledge, political understanding, that sort of thing. And then you sat the exam in your professional category, which for me was international law. It's one of my theories that everyone's life is so much chance and accident more than design. Maybe there's a little bit of both, but I can look back in my life and see so many accidents. And this was one of them. I think if I hadn't been actually teaching, if I hadn't finished a master's in international law, and if I hadn't been teaching international law at master's level for 2 years, there's no way I would have been able to ace the exam in the way that I did. But anyway, I got through, and I got a letter from the UN, and they said, please give us a list of where you would like to work in the world. And this was so exciting. I wanted to go as far away from Australia as possible. So I looked down the list, and I've been actually specialising in law of the sea, which turned out to be very good for the international law of migrant smuggling, by the way. I didn't use that knowledge for 20 years, but then I really needed it. I didn't want to go anywhere that was kind of like home, so I didn't want to go to New York. I definitely didn't want to go to Switzerland, the European headquarters of the UN. That just sounded too deadly for words. But then I saw on the list that the Law of the Sea Institute, the United Nations Law of the Sea Institute, was in Jamaica. And that sounded just perfect, so I put Jamaica up the top. And yeah, of course, they didn't send me to Jamaica, they sent me to Geneva in Switzerland. So that's where I spent the next 12 years pretty much. I went to that part of the UN that deals with human rights. It's now called the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Back then, it was called the Centre for Human Rights. It wasn't as important as a High Commissioner's office. And I think it took me a while to realise that human rights are very much a sideshow at the United Nations. They play a very important political role, and etc., but human rights are not a huge priority for UN member states, and that's kind of reflected in the structure and functioning and mandate of that part of the organisation that deals with human rights. I can talk a little bit about that later. But anyway, so I spent that 12 years at the UN from 1990, 92 or something until 2003. And it was actually, I think it was a wonderful time to be there. There were so many things were happening. At the time, one doesn't really understand, but in retrospect, I can look back and think about all the things that were going on and think about how exciting it actually was. For one thing, this was the era of modern peacekeeping. So the UN had always had these small peacekeeping forces, but this really came to the fore as a major function of the organisation through the 1990s. And we were involved in delivering human rights training, the first ever human rights training to peacekeepers. So thousands and thousands of, tens of thousands of military and civilian police peacekeepers were being deployed all over the world, from Bosnia to Mozambique to everywhere else. And it was our job to actually sit down and figure out how we were going to train these peacekeepers, at least not to violate human rights, and hopefully to have some hand in protecting and promoting human rights. And if I look back now, this is just considered standard. This is part of what happens for pre-deployment for UN peacekeepers, but back then it was something very new. I can remember a time when the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York wouldn't pick up the phone if it was the Centre for Human Rights in Geneva calling. But now things have changed quite a bit. This was also the era where that something that I'm sure that you take completely for granted, was absolutely new, and that was the idea of women's human rights. The idea that international human rights law had a role to play in dealing with violence against women. Not just violence committed by or perpetrated by the state, but also violence committed by private actors in relation to which the state failed to take any effective action. I can remember the Beijing Conference for Women, one of the first big events I was involved in at the UN, and Hillary Clinton up on the podium. She was just the president's wife then, but she was very powerful, and she named all of the human rights violations, the big ones, bride burning and sale of children and trafficking in persons and domestic violence, and all of the big human rights violations that were happening everywhere and that were not getting the attention that they deserved. And she just stood up on the podium and she said, it's time that women's rights are recognised as human rights, and human rights are recognised as women's rights. So something really obvious, but that was actually the first time that had been articulated so clearly and at such an important level. And I can look back now and see how that particular conference, even with all of its compromises and the slips and retreats that kind of happened afterwards in relation to certain issues, that conference did provide the springboard for a fundamental change within the international human rights system. I was involved in this very kind of experimental project within the Centre for Human Rights to try and encourage the treaty bodies to take a more gendered approach to their work, and my goodness, that was just such a struggle. We basically got shut out of the Committee on Racial Discrimination. They said that was absolutely irrelevant to anything that they were doing, and it was a huge waste of time. This was the chairperson of the Committee on Racial Discrimination, and the chairperson of the Committee Against Torture pretty much had exactly the same reaction. And if you think about how we think about torture now and how we understand torture and the gendered nature of torture, you can actually see how far we've come. The other big development around about the time I was at the UN, of course, was around the first steps that were taken towards an international criminal court. When I was at law school, when I was your age, I can remember looking at Bassiouni's book on international criminal law and an international criminal court in the library, and just thinking how amazing international lawyers are with their fantasies and their ability to conjure up a better world that's not based on anything that's really happening in the real world. Well, yeah, I was wrong, because Bassiouni's dream became a reality, and we had the international criminal tribunals, which provided the political basis and the idea of how something like this would actually work, and allowed us to have an international criminal court. I think all of you know that the court is up and running, it's functioning, it's there, and that's probably the most important thing. It's not as strong politically as it should be, and of course one of the main reasons for that is that the United States is not party to the International Criminal Court statute, even though the US was so closely involved in the development of that statute. And the result, the statute of the International Criminal Court, very much reflects US lobbying and US interests and US expertise. So I don't know, that's something that probably will also change in your lifetime, but it's probably up to your generation and no longer mine to make sure that actually happens. And then, of course, we had trafficking. So when I was at the United Nations and I was sort of doing some work around human rights of women and gender and things like that, a lot of issues were really completely off the table. I'd sit in the Human Rights Commission, which was the predecessor to the current Human Rights Council, And, all that states were talking about was torture and racial discrimination, like really important stuff, but the kind of hard human rights issues that related to violence against women, for example, issues related to migrants, the rights of migrants, forced marriage, child sexual exploitation. All of these issues were relegated right to the periphery of the international human rights system. So there was a working group of a working group of a working group that did something on these things, but nobody went there and nobody listened actually to what they said. So when Mary Robinson became High Commissioner for Human Rights in 1998, during the first months of her, we'd never had someone like her before. They'd all of the chiefs of human rights up until then had been these fonctionnaires, like they're just civil servants, and all they cared about was making sure that I'm being a little unfair, I'm painting a broad brush, but really they cared about making sure that the states weren't upset with our part of the UN and kept giving us money. Mary Robinson was completely different. And so during her first months, she travelled around the world and she met young women in Moldova who'd come back from Western Europe where they thought they were going to do some kind of job and they ended up locked up in brothels. She went to Cambodia and met these survivors of human trafficking that nobody else was talking about or nobody else really knew about. So she came back to Geneva and said that she wanted to do something on human trafficking. And once again, fate and circumstance and luck. I was just in the right place at the right time, and I got to be her advisor on human trafficking, and that expanded to migrant smuggling because a month or two after she made that decision, the international community fortuitously decided that they were going to develop a convention on transnational organised crime, which was really starting to worry states. The fact that the capacity of states to deal with criminal groups was being seriously compromised by the capacity of the criminal groups to operate across national borders. And states were seeing this particularly with migration issues, with the smuggling of small arms, drugs, of course, that sort of thing. So anyway, they didn't just decide to do a treaty on transnational organised crime. They also decided to create some mini treaties under those which are called protocols, one related to trafficking in persons and one related to smuggling in migrants. Now this was kind of weird for us, the whole trafficking thing, because since even the charter of the League of Nations, trafficking, like this whole, we thought about trafficking then as basically moving women across borders for sexual exploitation. But that issue, like that term, was a human rights one completely. We owned it. And even though we hadn't done anything, we'd actually been completely useless in relation to this. We did feel this sense of ownership. So when the UN decided to develop this treaty on trafficking under the umbrella of the UN's Crime Commission, not in human rights, we were just absolutely outraged. And it's been a great evolution, I think, in my learning to be able to look back and to realise that was such a good thing. Because if we'd kept this thing in human rights, if we'd even tried to develop a treaty on trafficking with human rights, it probably wouldn't have worked. We would have never had such a strong treaty as they developed in the framework of crime control and transnational organised crime. We would have never had these provisions on mutual legal assistance and extradition that now, because of my field work, I realise are absolutely essential to doing something about this. We would have never had this treaty enter into force months practically after it was actually adopted by the General Assembly, and we would never have had a specialist human rights treaty like that has, I think, 167 or something states parties. So, a long detour to explain that even though we were all a bit upset, it ended up being a good thing. But I was sent to Vienna for the duration of the negotiations around the trafficking protocol, with the task of making sure that the final result ended up being at least some kind of net gain for trafficked persons and their rights. That our job, like my job through Mary Robinson's job, work through me, was to make sure that human rights were recognised in this instrument, and that at least we didn't end up with something on trafficking that was bad for victims and their rights. we ended up actually getting a group of UN agencies together. So it was UNHCR and International Organization for Migration and UNICEF, and we started to review all of the drafts and make submissions, and I'd make these speeches on behalf of the High Commissioner, and it was great. And the final result wasn't that good in terms of human rights, but it was much better than we would have had without that. So that was, the protocol was finished, and we came back to Geneva, and then the High Commissioner said, well, this is still really not very good. There are so many human rights that actually apply to trafficking in persons, but they're all scattered everywhere and nobody knows which ones are which. So can you please convene a group of people who know about this stuff and come up with what turned out to be the UN Principles and Guidelines on Human Rights and Human Trafficking. So yeah, that was really great. And even though there was a last-minute attempt by kind of the powers that be, while the High Commissioner was in New York, to kind of stop this, because they felt that the High Commissioner was getting too big for her boots and that she was not acting like a UN official, she was actually acting like an advocate. It didn't work, and the High Commissioner ended up getting these principles and guidelines attached to her final report to the Economic and Social Council, and that made them, in crazy UN regulations, that made them a document, a United Nations document, an official UN document, so it gave them a status that they would not have otherwise had. So anyway, that was a great time, and I'm sort of up to 2002 now, and the High Commissioner, I think, had upset enough countries, including the United States, by being an advocate for human rights. I think her sense was very much that her loyalties were to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and not necessarily to the member states. So she criticised the invasion of Kosovo and just sort of put her head above the parapet. And so she paid the price. And when the time came for her, the question of whether she would be reappointed came to the General Assembly, it was blocked. And she left. And I left not too much longer after that. I had a permanent appointment at the UN, so it was kind of a bit of a struggle to figure out whether I should leave this place. But I think that it had become a bit of a gilded cage for me, so I was very happy to leave. And then I went to, basically since 2003, I've been running this very large anti-trafficking program in Southeast Asia. It's the biggest criminal justice intervention against trafficking in the world. It's been funded very generously, and we work with and through the member states of ASEAN, so countries from Philippines to Myanmar to Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, etc. Those 10 member states, Singapore, Malaysia. And basically the focus of our work is to work with to actually work with police and prosecutors and judges, and also around law reform, to develop stronger and more effective criminal justice responses to trafficking. And also, of course, to make sure that what we're doing is, through institutional reform or law reform, even training and stuff like that, inculcating this in a practical way, this idea of a human rights-based response to trafficking. So the funny thing is that the police and prosecutors and judges I work with, I don't think any of them know, in fact, that I'm a human rights lawyer, that's my mindset, and that's how I think about things, and that's how I actually analyse things. But it's I think it comes through in how we do our work and how we measure our success as well. And there's a bit of a lesson in that as well. Human rights can be, my experience of human rights people is that they can be a bit righteous. Maybe it's an occupational hazard in a way, human rights can be off-putting to people because it comes with so much baggage, especially when you're working with, for example, criminal justice practitioners. So I've found a softer and less confrontational approach seems to reap particular rewards. Now, I only wanted to talk for a few more minutes, and I just want to finish up by maybe pointing out a few of the dilemmas and the obstacles that I've come up against, maybe in recent times. My sense of human rights was always of something that was complete, that if only people understood the holistic nature of human rights, if only they understood that all human rights were indivisible and, that this was sort of a complete package, that somehow they would understand everything much better. And I guess I'm being a little bit clumsy in moving towards a realisation that I've had that the entire human rights project itself is quite imperfect. There's the basic problem of politics, that you're getting states to develop laws that are designed to constrain them. You're also, for me, the entire rationale of human rights is about the redistribution of power. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So you're trying to take power away from those that have a lot and give power to those who don't have very much. So you're taking power away from the state and giving it to citizens. You're taking power away from majorities and giving it to minorities. You're taking power away from men and giving it to women, and in some cases from adults and giving it to children. Now you just have to think about your own lives and your own experiences to know very well that those who have power don't give it up very easily. So there's this constant tension between like what states profess that they want to do and actually really what's in their hearts. Someone, much better international lawyer than me, once described the international human rights system like a hen house. So the fox has decided, she's sworn off chickens. She knows it's bad to go in there and rip those chickens apart. So she's decided she's going to build this hen house and keep herself away from the chickens. But, you never know. You never know when starvation might lurk, when you might really need those chickens. So she builds the hen house, but she has all these little weaknesses and gaps in the fence just so in case she can sneak through. And I think to understand human rights like that helps us to understand some of the paradoxes. And I sometimes feel like people like me who we're trying to sell the human rights system, I've started to wonder if sometimes we do the system and ourselves a disservice by kind of papering over that, by imagining that the human rights system is actually much better than it really is, that it's much stronger and much more consistent. So I've got a couple of, just a couple of issues and things that have come up, I've come up against. So one of them, of course, is this idea that I learnt at the United Nations and I parroted whenever I gave briefings on the UN's human rights system to all the visitors that came to the UN, that human rights are, there's no conflict between rights. There's no hierarchy between rights, and there's no conflict actually, that it's impossible to have a conflict. And I completely believe that because it sounded right, but I think the more that I've learned and the more that I've lived, the more I understand that of course that's not true. There are conflicts between rights, and it's quite possible that some human rights are way, way more important than other human rights. So this is, I'm not a UN official anymore, but for a UN human rights official, that's blasphemy. That's really, which leads me to one of the obvious conflicts, which I come across so much in a lot of my work, and that's the conflict between freedom of religion and the rights of women. Not talked about terribly much, but coming up more and more in real life. So whether it's about France and their regulation of what women should wear, to questions now in Australia and the UK about whether Sharia courts should be recognised in relation to property and family matters. Now, all of you, I don't need to go into detail for all of you to see a fundamental conflict between the right to freedom of religion, something very, very important that's been at the heart of the human rights movement since its inception, and the human rights of women. And I think that discussion is very difficult for human rights lawyers in particular to have, but that's not very good, that we shy away from these things. Another one that's actually much closer to I've started to do work on two areas of trafficking that are a little bit unusual, and that one of them relates to international commercial surrogacy, and the other relates to trafficking in persons for removal of organs. So, just a show of hands. So, how many of you think that it's okay for a woman, who just does, might not have another source of income or something like that, to take the decision to offer, her body for surrogacy, to carry another person's child and get paid for it. So how many of you think that, because we're talking about personal autonomy and all the things that have always been important in relation to articulating human rights of women, look, how many of you think that's okay? Okay, that's good. That's good, and maybe it is okay, but where I work and the situations that I'm coming up against, so I'll give you two examples that I'm most familiar with. The first one relates to India and the second one relates to Thailand. So in both of these countries we have documented cases, and in one it was, in several there have actually been court cases. So it actually wasn't the women who get the money and who want to do this, it's their husbands. Okay, so the women are being pushed into making this huge amount of money for their impoverished families. The other thing that has come up in many cases, it's not like you go and get impregnated and then you go home and look after your children. You're actually locked in a compound for the duration of your pregnancy. I need to say that not all cases are like this, and not all surrogacy organisations function like this, but certainly there's enough anecdotal evidence out there for us to worry about things like that. So you get hormonal injections to ensure that you're ready to receive the fetus. You then get other kinds of medications for the duration of your pregnancy. If there is too many embryos take, then there will be a selective reduction in the number of embryos. If the tests at 3, 5, whatever months show indications of Down syndrome or some other kind of genetic abnormality, you'll be forced to have an abortion. And then at the end of it, you might not get paid, or you might get paid much less than you were promised. So look, I'm only throwing this out to show you that even things that we take for granted, ideas of consent, ideas of autonomy, ideas of freedom, aren't as black and white in the real world. I don't have a particular answer to this. I'm not really sure what to think about poor Indian or Brazilian men who sell their kidneys, one of their kidneys, because they're of course left with one. Is it okay if they get enough medical information in the beginning that they actually get paid what they were told they were going to get paid, and that they have some kind of follow-up treatment? Does that make it okay? How do we draw these lines, and how do we conceptualise the idea of consent, which is so central to how we think about human rights in so many ways? So I've just been in Vienna at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, where we've been looking, as Larry said, into the problematic aspects of the definition of trafficking. And one of the concepts we've been looking at is the irrelevance of consent. So the Trafficking Protocol's definition says that if you use force, fraud, coercion, abuse of a position of vulnerability to, move someone into exploitation, then the consent of that person to the exploitation is irrelevant no matter what. So how do we really feel about that, and how does it actually work in practice? Because obviously it sort of makes sense if you're talking about force and fraud, because they seem to be consent damaging to start off with. But what about a concept like abuse of a position of vulnerability? What does that, everything turns on how you actually interpret abuse of a position of vulnerability to decide when consent is completely irrelevant. The bigger question, can someone consent to their own exploitation? Should it be all right that even if things don't go perfectly for this Indian or Thai surrogate, that she's consented and that should be respected? Or the Brazilian or Indian man who's decided to sell his kidney. So anyway, I just throw all of those things out to you. I don't have answers. These are just the sorts of things that I'm struggling with internally, but also, much more importantly, we're struggling with at the international level, because we're developing laws and policies around these issues at the moment, and maybe with an incomplete understanding of all the different permutations. So I'll end there. I think we've got 25 minutes for questions. I hope I've given you enough fuel to start a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'll just turn over I have lots of questions, but I'd rather hear from you for your questions. So anyone want to get us started? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't understand maybe some very naive question. From Peacekeepers to Slave Traders, the title of this seminar.
Oh, okay. Well, I can explain that very easily. So I think that what is in that heading is, I think, a bit of an explanation of my career path, where I went from working with UN peacekeepers and trying to help develop a human rights aspect to international peacekeeping, right through to the work I do now, which is working on trafficking and particularly looking at the criminal justice aspects of trafficking and bringing perpetrators to justice. So a little bit of poetic license there, but I think the interesting things are perhaps in the middle and around both of those.
John?
How do you thread the needle between, on the one hand, having these human rights that we as a society recognize, and those human rights in many cases coming from the developed world, and not turning into these nations who are violating them feeling like this is some kind of neo-colonial or moral colonialism, where even though we believe that these are universal human rights, having someone coming from Australia or America or the first world into my third world country and trying to not force this, but trying to implement these things, how do we do that in a way that is conducive to empowering those nations, as opposed to feeling like those nations are having another nation or another group of nations forcing something on them?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and I think it's an eternal struggle for human rights. It's probably another dilemma that I could flag. Are human rights relative in some sense? Are certain human rights more important in some cultures and some contexts than others? And I don't have a great answer for it. On one level, I feel like this debate around human rights relativity was kind of captured by elites in countries that didn't necessarily want to bring human rights into their systems for exactly the reasons I talked about the redistribution of power. So I think a really simplistic way of answering that is when you're looking at very basic rights, whether you're talking about the right to food or the right to be free from torture. It doesn't seem to matter what country I work in, and I think I've worked in 70 or 80 now. Everyone speaks the same language, and the only time there's a difference in the language is when you're actually talking to the elites, the ones that hold the power. In terms of kind of avoiding that whole neo-colonial thing, I think part of that is making human rights much more the language of humanity and not the language of the United States and Australia and rich parts of the world. And I think that during the time, like the 30 years now or something that I've been working on human rights, I've seen that become much more of a reality. Even in the composition of the people who have office holders within the UN's human rights system, like the rapporteurs and all of that kind of thing, the members of the working groups, there's much more, I think, diversity, but at the same time, a stronger common language that actually helps that. But, of course, we have to be aware of that. I'm sure some of you are well aware of the US TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report. So every year the United States government, since 2001, have made a report. I think they do it on religion and drugs and a few other things as well, these congressionally mandated reports. A report on an assessment of every country in the world in relation to how they're dealing with trafficking in persons. Hillary Clinton, I think, took a very wise step in including the United States for the first time, I think in 2010, 2011?
A little before.
Oh, okay. So, but, I work with countries that are so deeply insulted by that, because not only are there assessments, but they get a ranking, like ABC fail. And, I have problems with the report. It's very hard for an international lawyer to not feel deeply offended with this idea of a unilateral compliance mechanism. It kind of just goes against what we're working towards. So there's that. The other problem that I have with this report is that it takes the standards that are set out in US law, not the standards that are in international law, which we have. Like, we actually have a really strong legal framework around trafficking in persons, and countries are judged on US standards, not on the standards that they have agreed to abide by. So they're the fundamental flaws, and I think that causes the kinds of problems that you've been heading towards in your question. But I work at the front line in these countries, and I spend an awful lot of time with ministers of justice and their officials and with the police and prosecutors, and I just know so well that the kind of traction we have in getting good responses to human trafficking wouldn't be the same without that report. And I also know perfectly well that the United Nations is not capable of coming up with something that would displace it. So yeah, this is a struggle that I think we have to fight with both hands.
Okay, sure.
I guess I have a question about your thoughts about consent, or the issue that you brought up with consent, and that it seems to me that limiting or saying that people cannot consent to something even under obviously coercion, as you said, or fraud. That's easy, but the rest of those, I'm trying to remember exactly the one.
Abuse of a position of vulnerability
abuse of a position of vulnerability. That even though maybe it's inaccurate, like in a real world sense, trying to track the real world, inaccurate to speak about that being about consent in those issues, but by allowing there to be possible consent by people like that, we open ourselves up to having an issue of creating a violation by the victim, so that we end up. I'm thinking for women who end up in a brothel, not because they were coerced to going there, or there was fraud to go there, but make that decision, but because they feel that they don't have any other decision because they're in a vulnerable position. That if we don't say that there's no consent there, that then we create them as a perpetrator as well. In many of these countries, or in many parts of the world where it is illegal to be a prostitute, right? So it makes it much harder to protect a woman who's in that situation.
I agree.
So I guess I'm just curious more on your thoughts about when you say that you see that issue.
Consent is really a fraught issue in law anyway. I'm sure it's not just in relation to human rights and trafficking that you've come up against the issue of consent, because it's a concept that has always been very problematic. I have a long answer to your question, and that's contained in a report that the UN that I wrote for the UN that was released last week, and that examines the principle of the irrelevance of consent in the context of the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. So in relation, basically I looked at the drafting history, like what were the drafters actually thinking when they put that in, and how does this idea of what consent is in the Trafficking Protocol, how does it fit within broader criminal justice views and trends in relation to consent in different legal systems. And then what we did, we went to 12 different countries and we looked at how their laws had incorporated this principle or not, but more importantly, what had actually happened on the ground, what kind of cases were being dropped or pursued around the issue of consent. And there was really two conflicting trends. So one of the ones that we saw was a trend where the concept, the irrelevance of consent mixed with a very broad interpretation of abuse of a position of vulnerability has been used to, in Switzerland, to basically say, the courts say that all migrant prostitution, no matter what, is trafficking. So anyone involved in the prostitution of a migrant, like not the migrant herself, she's not criminalised, but anyone involved or having anything to do with that is a trafficker. And what they say is that if you're a migrant and you're working in the sex industry, well, you're vulnerable. Then a series of cases, that's way bigger than what the drafters of the trafficking protocol ever imagined. Another series of cases in the Netherlands, was actually 2 cases, but it involved these irregular Chinese migrants who were really in quite a bad way, going to a Chinese businessman and begging him for work. And he said, "You're okay, you can work in my restaurant and you can, live there." So the accommodation was pretty bad, and they didn't get paid very much. Like they got paid, I think, between a third and a half of the mandated minimum wage. But they could go if they wanted to, and they weren't trapped there. But this guy was done for trafficking, because basically they said it doesn't matter if they consented because that's irrelevant, and clearly their vulnerability was being abused. So look, I think the issues around consent are really live. I'll be in The Hague in a month or 2 talking about this whole issue of trafficking in persons for removal of organs. The thing you raised about those who are selling their organs then becoming criminals is a very live one in a number of countries, because if they're not recognised as victims, then this is what happens. They're actually breaking the law because they're being involved in trafficking. But then the broader question around, when do you define this as a trafficking crime, and when do you define it as something else, like maybe breaking organ transplant laws or something like that, and how relevant, if at all, is the question of the consent of the person. And that's I think a big problem. And then at the other extreme, I'll just stop at this point, we also see that it can work both ways. In a number of countries, the obsessive disregarding consent can lead to unfair prosecutions, but then also just paying strict attention to consent can mean some cases that actually should be identified as trafficking. They look at it and say, well, she said that she wanted to be in that brothel, or she agreed to come to this country to work or something, so we're not going to do anything about it. Yeah, so this is stuff that's actually happening right now, and I think the policy and laws that will be shaped around these issues in the next couple of years are it's going to be quite an exciting time.
Daria?
Yeah, I think you mentioned taking sort of a softer approach to human rights to be able to more effectively collaborate with other actors like the criminal justice system. And I was just wondering if you would speak a little bit more about that.
Okay, yeah. This is, maybe I'll just do that through an example. So for me, I love working on trafficking, and trafficking is so interesting to work on in relation to criminal justice responses in particular. But if I really interrogate what I'm trying to do, I'm actually trying to improve the capacity of these national criminal justice systems to conduct fair trials and to ameliorate all those things that lead to miscarriages of justice in all these countries. So for me, trafficking is kind of the entry point. So that because governments are kind of vulnerable because of the United States, and because nobody wants to be seen to be in bed with the traffickers, so they say, yes, come in and have a look at our laws. And we say, well, you need to change the trafficking law and we'll help you with that. And by the way, your evidence laws, maybe we can shake those up a little bit and give them some gentle suggestions. And this list of capital crimes, you might want to take trafficking out of that, because really all of the evidentiary problems associated with trafficking prosecutions means that this is kind of not a good crime to kill someone for when they're found guilty. So it's that sort of, not going in there and saying that the death penalty is just shocking and how can you do this, and you are, your evidence law is not permitting fair trials. So it's much more about that. It's much more about, I think, learning, and it's taken me a very long time, learning how to speak their language, how to communicate with these people on their own level. And I started that training back in the UN because I had all those years of working with the peacekeepers, with the police, with judges when we were doing administration of justice training. But I learned that I had to not be a different person, but to respect very much the people that I was working with, and to respect their capacity for professionalism, if not the reality of their professionalism. And now I sometimes feel like I've gone too far, because then when I talk to people who are NGO people or people who are strictly blinkered on human rights, I find I have much less in common with them. For example, if you take trafficking, the whole issue of criminal justice responses around trafficking is a very fraught one for NGOs who see it as just too difficult and too full of potential human rights pitfalls. So I'm not quite as close to the NGO community as I may have been if I hadn't had this experience.
Ashley?
You mentioned that in, I think it was 2002, High Commissioner Mary Robinson left the UN. Well, she was blocked and left. How do you think the UN has done since then in promoting human rights? And have there been other High Commissioners who've sort of stepped into her shoes at all?
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question. I feel like Mary Robinson was kind of a circuit breaker in a way, because it became very hard after the appointment of someone like that, even though she scarred some states, it became very hard for them to go back to the diplomatic appointments, which was all I ever knew before her, the fonctionnaires. So it was, I think politically, in fact, it was impossible to do that. So then they got Sergio Villadanello, who, even though he was really, a UN guy through and through, he was also known as a strong human rights person, and then Louise Arbour and everyone who's come since. And I think the current incumbent is perhaps the best example where this is now going to continue. We're not going to have the old kind of human rights commissioner anymore, thank goodness. And I think the other thing is that, it's a little bit like the residual powers of the Secretary General. It's amazing that the Secretary General of the UN it's a very powerful position. And it really, it's up to the incumbent to figure out how they're going to work with that power, because they're residual and because they're not, he can almost do what he likes. Now, the most successful UN Secretary General, in my view, was Dag Hammarskjöld, who didn't last very long. And the same kind of thing happened when he was appointed. They wanted someone. There was this famous phrase. They wanted someone who was more secretary than general. So they got this, really mild-mannered, very, very quiet Swedish diplomat, and he just powered. He just powered through. And we don't know exactly how his plane was shot down, but yeah, it's there's certainly fuel for conspiracy theorists that the most effective UN Secretary General before or since met such an untimely end. So look, I've deviated a little bit. I think that in relation to the leadership of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, we're on solid ground. Clearly, the Human Rights Council itself is in pretty serious trouble in relation to its credibility, I think, and that's just awful. I think there were so many hopes vested in getting rid of that ghastly Human Rights Commission and setting up something new. And we see little pockets of light. I think that the Universal Periodic Review, this idea that countries are sort of reviewed in their entirety. Because I've worked in some of these countries while they're being reviewed, I understand the impact that it has on them and how it can actually help to shape things and change things and give civil society some weapons with which to redress the imbalance of power between the state and civil society. But another hopeful for me is the investigative mechanisms, like the special rapporteurs and the various expert committees that have been developed. But at the end of the day, I feel like if we were to create the UN's human rights system today, if that was our job, so to create the treaties, to create the council, to create all of these special rapporteurs, it wouldn't happen. It absolutely wouldn't happen. This was an accident of history. I feel like, very much like the trafficking protocol, I feel like states on the whole regret, and like the Refugee Convention, they regret actually ever doing that, and they can't wind it back. But I think we're going to be waiting a while to see the kind of institutional reform that would reflect the sort of shifts in thoughts and ideas about human rights that we probably, most of us, want.
So time for one more question, if anyone has one. Well, given the I'm going to take the prerogative then. You know, I wanted to ask you a little bit, Anne, about, you've spoken in response to the last question about the challenges within the United Nations. I wonder if you could speak more specifically to whether in your work you see any real possibilities of backlash. That is, so for example, I can give you, with respect to the LGBT human rights movement, which is one that Secretary Clinton also really championed with that same phrase.
Yes.
Yeah, but a few years later. There has been an enormous negative response in certain parts of the world, in Central Asia, in Russia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in a number of those countries. So there's an area where I think you see a backlash against some progressive developments in international human rights. And I wondered if you saw any other areas where there might be a similar kind of negative response by states to some issue that you've worked on over the course of your career.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I'm almost relieved that I've only got a few minutes to answer it. Well, look, definitely, I think the one that you flagged is probably the one that I would have, that this idea of LGBT rights, the idea that these certain groups in society that have been marginalised and discriminated against for so long should be entitled at an international level to certain enforceable rights and protections. I think, maybe it was too soon. But then at first I thought it was too soon, but then now I think that this could actually be symbolic of a broader backlash against human rights generally. I see it. I see it in trafficking. So I believe that states in 2000, when they signed up to the trafficking protocol, had no idea what they were getting themselves into. So, for example, the idea was that they would be sort of dealing with this abusive migration. I'm absolutely sure that if India, for example, imagined that trafficking would start to be associated with bonded labour, they would never have allowed that. And I think generally most states benefit in some way or other from the exploitation. That's part and parcel of our global economy and our individual lives. They might benefit from the fact that exploited migrants are within their territory. They also might benefit from the remittances that their migrants send back to proper, inefficient and quite often corrupt regimes. So I guess, if I come back to my main area of focus, I see a backlash against expanding the rights of migrants in particular and expanding the rights of people who are exploited in migration. States were happy to develop some kind of very small exception to the general oppressive regime around migration. So if people were really treated terribly, then we would give them this small amount of protection under this treaty. But then the activists and some other states have come along and said, wow, trafficking is really big, in fact. And if you're talking about trafficking, then you should be dealing with this kind of forced labour, you should be dealing with bonded labour, you should be dealing with all of these other issues, child marriage, all of these things that make states very nervous. So, yeah, as I said, I came from this meeting, a couple of meetings in Vienna last week, and one of them was to the conference of parties to the Organised Crime Convention. So I was actually on the Australian delegation to that meeting. So that's the umbrella treaty that the trafficking treaty is under. And it was very close to bloodshed around two issues, which made me realise that this idea of a backlash is actually very real. So the two issues that were being discussed was, first of all, whether there would be a monitoring mechanism set up under the Organised Crime Convention and the protocol, something as simple as that. We take it for granted in human rights that we have these monitoring mechanisms, but a new treaty on an issue that could very well be a human rights issue, there's no way states are going to tie themselves to a monitoring mechanism. And states are divided, of course. The US was pushing for it, Australia was pushing for it, the Europeans, but other states, including South Africa, Belarus, a whole lot of other states were vociferously opposed to it. The other issue that caused a complete breakdown of the negotiations, this is organised crime and trafficking, like there's so many things they could be talking about, it was whether non-governmental organisations would be permitted in the room when they're talking about, because they've set up little working groups on trafficking, working groups on migrant smuggling, etc., etc. So it wasn't about whether they would speak, it was just about whether NGOs would be in the room. So once again, look at the things that we take for granted in the international human rights system, like NGOs are just part of it. But I'm pretty sure that if states had their way and they had their time over again, the kinds of vociferous debates and attempts to squash down anything that smacks of oversight or monitoring or civil society participation, we'd see that in human rights as well. So maybe we should be grateful. We can also think that the glass is half full, and at least we got that. Thank you.
So we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Anne Gallagher.